Hello and welcome to the Pandaverse. I'm Elgon Williams. I've got Christine Gabriel here with me. Today
Hi guys.
we're gonna do a book reading and an interview with Sharon Friedman. She's got a book titled Ashes, set in 1903. Welcome, Sharon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Excited.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and an introduction to your book, and then you're going to do a brief reading.
And then I hope we'll get to talk about it. I am from Florida, originally South Florida, proud University of Florida Gator. Don't hold that against me if you're from another state that we're against and don't work well with. I started my career as a teacher. I taught English in high school and junior high. Took off time to have my children. I have 2 children and 3 great-grandchildren. 3 grandchildren who are great, not that they are my great-grandchildren. When my children started going to school, I started to freelance write. Was selling just enough, I guess, to keep my ego going, but not enough to keep our dogs in kibbles and bits. So I ultimately stopped freelancing and went to work. I was in the nonprofit area as doing marketing, direct marketing. Then I went on and went to a seminar company, started out as a copywriter and editor, and retired finally as director of the seminar division for marketing for them. I have always wanted to write. It took me 40 years to actually get to writing a novel. So it's been a little bit of a journey for me, definitely. Ashes was in my head for those 40 years, and it's based on or a tribute to my grandparents and my great aunts and uncle who came to this country from Austria, not from Russia. In the book, it's Russia. And they all basically found work in the garment industry in one form or another. The women were seamstresses, the men were cutters. They were one of my uncles was a furrier. One of them made hats, but they all worked under the circumstances and conditions that were as poor as they're described in the book. I want to be clear, though, that they came to this country in 1912, which is a year after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. They were not involved in the fire, but they had friends who either lost loved ones or knew of family members that had been very badly injured in the fire. When I was growing up, all of my great aunts and uncles and my grandparents were living in South Florida. They were very close, and as a child, I grew up listening to stories about the garment industry, and they stuck with me for a very long time. So when I finally retired, I kind of ran out of excuses for not writing the book. I dabbled a little bit in freelancing again, did internet work, and just decided that it was time to knuckle down and write the book. So that's how the book came about. The fire is kind of the centerpiece of the book, but there are other historical events in the book too. There is the Kishinev pogrom, which happened in Russia. It was a real event, a true event. Much of what is in the book is based on actual occurrences during that pogrom. And then when they come to America, of course, the trip over is never pleasant, was never pleasant for immigrants. So we covered that. And then another historical event in the book is the first general strike in the garment industry. Very impactful, not only for the way the girls were treated, and they were treated very poorly. They were harassed, they were arrested, they were spit at, they were hurt. The police hurt them. The police were on the payroll of the government and on the owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, and other owners were paying the police to harass the women on the lines. But not only did the strike impact the workers and working conditions, it was actually became the model for the suffragette movement. Later on, the success of the strike became a model for how the women went after vote, which was very, very important. And then ultimately the book takes you to the fire. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was in 1911. At the time, the shirtwaist, which I don't know if people know what it is, it was a blouse that looked, if you know what the Gibson girl blouse looked like, it was very high-necked, it was form-fitting and long. That had become it was a major change in fashion for women. And a very fancy one was worn by the very wealthy, and the very plain ones became part of the uniform of the working girl at the time. So there were factories all over New York churning out these very inexpensive blouses. And they were all being worked by immigrants, young immigrants, primarily Italian and Jewish immigrants who came to the country looking for work. And the reason the owners wanted these young women and young men, the immigrants working in their factories, is that they did not know what their rights were, what few rights they had at the time. And they would work for very little money. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was the worst in terms of conditions, safety conditions. The doors were locked with the exception of one because the owners were afraid that the workers would steal. What would they steal? They could steal needles, little pieces of lace, or garment, figments, rags from the garments. Because they were so worried about that, they would lock the doors. There was one elevator for them, only one that they could use. And they were on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floor of the Ash building, which only had one fire escape because the building itself was fireproof. The exterior, the interior was not. So when the fire happened, the young girls and young men had very little access to escape. Many of them were burned in the factory, but many of them jumped rather than burn. A lot of the young women would just, rather than burn up in there, they jumped, and the young men too. About 50 of them, of the 146 that died in that factory, jumped. What I'd like to do is read a little bit about the fire so that you get an idea of what happened, and then we can talk about anything you would like. This is based on a real event in the fire. First of all, on the outside around the the building, the fire department and police arrived within minutes of the blaze's discovery. By now, the street was clogged with thousands of onlookers screaming and turning their faces away from the atrocity of young women leaping to their deaths, crashing limp and broken to the pavement like dolls. Hopes for rescue turned into utter despair when it was discovered the fire engine's ladders only reached to the 6th floor, the fire hoses to the 7th. The safety nets spread out to catch the jumping workers quickly proved to be useless. The force of so many men and women jumping at once ripped the nets from the hands of the rescuers, while the impact of others leaping from the top floors tore gaping holes in the nets. The efforts of the firemen to fight the blaze from the ground and the rescue workers were futile. Now the police were moving the crowd back so they would not be injured by falling bodies. And then going on in the building, reaching the window, they stared in belief as the scene unfolding before them. Girl after girl climbed through the window onto the ledge. Some hesitated before jumping into the nothingness that awaited them. Most leaped wordlessly as the flames rose through the window and urged them on. Louis, the chief cutter, gently lifted a crying girl who wrapped her arms around his neck. With tears in his eyes, he carried her to the window and kissed her. Holding her away from the building, he let her drop and without hesitation followed her in death. The street was littered with broken and burned bodies. The smell of burnt flesh filled the air. One after another, the workers climbed into the ledge and chose death on the sidewalk over death in the inferno of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. Each thump of a body drew screams of horror from the onlookers. As the bodies piled up, women fainted and men cried out in torment. Crazed by the carnage on the street, family members tried to break free of the police cordon in a desperate attempt to find a loved one. The torrent of water flowing from the fire hoses into the gutter ran red with blood. The girls of the Triangle kept jumping out the windows of the Ash building. And that is all based on actual first-person accounts. The research for the book was pretty extensive.
Wow, that's powerful.
That is so powerful. It's
it was it was hard. It was hard to write. There were two scenes in there that really were very, very difficult for me to write. And one is there's a scene in the cellar in Russia, the Kishinev, when the family, the villagers run a home. That was extraordinarily difficult for me to write as a mother, to think about what happened in that cellar. And then obviously the fire, and deciding who was not going to survive was very difficult. So yeah.
Aww.
Yeah.
That's
So
very, wow, it's just powerful.
well, thank you. You know, the thing with the book too that was very eye-opening for me, I had been writing, as I said, most of my life. In the last few years, I was writing articles for Examiner.com and Yahoo News, and I was so used to banging out an article a day, I thought, well, I can do this. I'll research for a few months, and I'll write for a few months, and I'll set it aside, and I'll have a draft by the end of the first year. No, it didn't work that way. It took 2.5 years to research and write the book. And it was the research that I felt compelled to make sure it was right, to do honor to all these people that didn't survive and lived through that. So yeah.
I
So
think
that
you
was,
did a very nice job.
well, thank you very much. Yeah, it was definitely a labor of love, but it was very humbling too, because it was hard in so many different spots. Yeah, so that made it a little more difficult.
I think having connection to your own roots, and the people who knew people that had actually suffered in Russia and came to America to escape the persecution and the oppression, and people who had worked in the factories and died because of poor regulation over the industry, poor regulation over the fire standards of the buildings. I mean, unfortunately, tragedies like this result. It takes things like this happening for the people to be so outraged that they move our governments to passing laws and regulations to protect people. That didn't exist, in the early part of the last century.
No, and actually what little good, well, not little, but what did come from what happened in the shirtwaist factory is that they began to pass legislation to protect workers. It started at the state level, and then when FDR came into office, he put Frances Perkins, who was the first female Secretary of Labor, in place, and she was very much for getting good working conditions and safe working conditions for the girls. They had sprinklers at that time. That was something that I did not know. But the Ash building at that time, or the top 3 floors, did not have sprinklers, which would have saved them too. It only took 18 minutes for the fire to start and just go up and kill that many people. And it was because there were oily rags on the floor, there were paper patterns hanging. The women worked very close together, not only close shoved in, but narrow aisles between all of the sewing machines. And once it went up, it was just a recipe for disaster. They never stood a chance, really. And so many who did not perish were very, very badly injured. People were jumping when they couldn't get on the elevator. They jumped as the elevator went down, hoping to land on the elevator, and missed or caught the iron cables and ripped their hands up. It was a terrible disaster. Until 9/11, that was the worst fire in New York City. So it gives you an idea.
And you had people jumping out of the building in 9/11 too. So
yes, that's true. When I started writing the book, I thought I would take it to 9/11. I was going to have Miriam, who's the main character, live into old age, and as a grandmother, go to the World Towers to have breakfast with her grandson who worked there, and as you know, the restaurant. And they went. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. I just couldn't bring it that far. And I promised Miriam in my head that she would have a happy ending. So this way she did. So yeah.
Aww.
Something else you should know too is that all the characters, the minor characters anyway, are named after my great aunts and uncles. And it was kind of my way of remembering them. Other members of my family, their names are in there too. And unfortunately, none of them lived long enough to know that, because it took me so long to write the book, but they're all in there. My grandmother's, my Jacob, who the way he's described when he has a mustache, that's what my grandfather looked like. They're in there. They're all in there. So that was fun.
I think a lot of people, in present day world, they discount the value and the necessity of the labor movement, the labor unions, and all the good they did back in those times to get laws passed and have safety standards established and everything. And maybe the unions are they have a certain amount of blame for the loss of focus in their movement, but they did some really valuable things back then to protect people. The problems with the business owners back then were that they were trying to make a buck and really didn't care who they ran over the top of to get that done. So they had very little respect for the workers. I'm making a blanket statement there because I'm sure there were some people that did respect their workers, but unfortunately this tended to be the norm.
It was, and they did take advantage, and especially the bigger manufacturers. Now, the owners for the shirtwaist were called the Shirtwaist King. They had other factories, and they were known for collecting insurance on fires. This was not their first. This was the deadliest, and I think this was the only one where people died and were hurt. But they were strictly for the bottom line. They did not care, and they were immigrants themselves, which was interesting to me. But they had no regard for their workers. And the scenes in there where the supervisor takes advantage of the girls, that's based on, that's the way it was then. I'm not, again, you can't make a blanket statement where you said everyone was that way, but it was not unusual for the supervisors to take advantage of these young girls, withhold work if the girls were not nice to them or whatever. And because the girls were paid piecework, by the way, by the number of pieces they did. So they were encouraged to move quickly and sew a lot. But then if they made mistakes, they were easily fired or had their paychecks docked for whatever was ruined. They paid for their own needles and thread. They were on an average week, they brought home $2. Now that's $2 in early 1900 money, but $2, that was it. On a good busy, when it got busy, they could make sometimes up to $8 an hour, but they were working up to 14 hours a day. No breaks. They were allowed one bathroom break. So they worked under terrible conditions, and it was the labor unions that made the difference. The International Ladies Garment Worker Union was instrumental in helping these girls get better pay and better conditions. We lost some of that today, I think.
I'm sitting here wondering because the garment industry has largely been removed from the United States, and it's gone primarily to Asia, I think. But I'm kind of wondering if these types of conditions exist in the Asian countries where the work goes on. You hear stories about the factory work condition, but we don't know. We don't really know the whole story, and we're not going to be told what happens in China or India or the other countries.
Exactly. It's not. There's very similar situations going on still in the world today. I know that I read, and I can't remember.
Is Myanmar?
In Myanmar, yes, I think there was a building collapse, similar circumstances because terrible conditions. In some of the Asian factories, they actually live in dormitories. They go from work to a dormitory that's owned by the company, and they're fed by the company, and then they go back to work, and it's a vicious cycle, and they become indebted to the company. The old company store, where you wind up owing money to your company because you have to buy your food or whatever from them. So yes, fortunately, it's better here in the United States.
In some of the places, they have 6 and 7 day work weeks.
right.
So,
And
Yeah,
children,
yeah.
children working too. And now these at the Sherpas, there were young girls as young as 12 working, doing what they called the kindergarten. They would just be cleaning threads, but they were still working long days, you know, and no breaks, and they were young children. So yeah, the circumstances were terrible. And even when the young women went on strike, it wasn't until some of the more wealthy matrons of New York got involved that the paper started paying attention, and they started getting the publicity they needed to get out there what was happening, because they even went to the mayor and he made promises and then nothing was done. And many of the police, as I said before, were on taking money from the owners. They hired prostitutes, be strike breakers, and they were the ones that were harassing the women on the line. So it was the conditions were terrible, and it took the union and it took the strike to get the ball rolling so that the improvements were made. And it was very brave on their part, because what happened for a lot of these young women who went on strike, they weren't getting paid anymore. The unions were giving them some money to live on, but it was never enough. And a lot of these young women were supporting their families. They were the ones that were bringing all the money in. In the Jewish tradition, the men study, you know, so a lot of them young girls were working to put brothers through school or to support even their fathers. In Ashes, Miriam's father's injured, but it was not unusual for these young girls to be supporting their families. So when they went on strike and they weren't getting any money, some of them were kicked out of their homes because they weren't bringing money in to help. It really was a very courageous thing for those young women to step out on a sidewalk with a placard and walk up and down and say, you know, we need better conditions. Definitely.
I don't think it was. I don't think the poor working conditions were exclusive to the garment industry either. I mean, of course, I'm old, but I'm not old enough to know exactly what was going on back then. But I have read things, and this is where the importance of studying history tells you a lot of things. And I know in England they had a huge problem with child labor in the mining industry there, in the coal mining industry in particular, and several cases where they had cave-ins and collapses and fires that killed young children that were working in the mine. And these are all poor people that are being abused by people that own the mines and own the instruments of business. And exclusive to England, that happened in the United States too.
Yes, definitely. But the other thing about Ashes that I hope people do get from the book is that it's ultimately about family values, because if you look at the situations they were in, the families, and not just Miriam's family, the Italian families, they supported each other and took care of each other, and they looked out for each other. And that to me was part of that immigrant story too. And I hope some of that came across. I am the grandchild of immigrants. I'm only second generation American. To think what my grandparents came through to get to this country, and then what they went through to make a better life for their children, so that my parents could make a better life for us and, for my brother and I. It really came home to me as I was researching this, and I, looking back and thinking about the sacrifices that these people made when they came here. They didn't speak the language, they didn't even understand the currency. They were dependent on the kindness of strangers, and very often it wasn't there, and living in the tenements was actually, Miriam and her family lived in a nice tenement because they had a bathroom and running water, even though the bathroom was down at the end of the hall. I mean, there were outhouses in the back of these tenements, most of these tenements, and that's how these people lived and came here looking for a better life, and that didn't always find it. I think that was what kind of pulled me up short too, because I was going by my family's experiences, but there were pretty sad stories out there. And so it gave me as just a newfound respect for what came before me, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I hope that comes across because, again, immigrant, you know, a lot of what's in the book we're talking about today in a slightly different version. And that seemed to me to come to the front more than I thought it would. So that was it. And then something else too I'd like to point out about the story, because, you know, when you're a debut writer, a new writer for a novel, I went about it the only way that I could logically in my head. So I wrote biographies for every single one of the characters I thought would be in there. I even did something today where I actually cast them in my head as actors and actresses so I could kind of have a picture. If you want to know, I envisioned Natalie Portman as,
Yes.
as Miriam, but she'd have had to, if she really wants the part, she's going to have to dye her hair red because she's not. And then I thought of Chris Evans with a mustache because he kind of has the same build that my grandfather had. And so I those were just two, and there are other characters too. But as I was writing, and I had this kind of outline, as I was writing, I don't know if it's because the characters were so personal to me, but they took over, and I departed drastically from where I thought I was going to go. And I found that very interesting and very disconcerting in the beginning. And then once I just said, okay, this is the way it's going to be, it really came together for me. And there were characters that I thought I would have in the book that never made it. And there were characters that I had never envisioned that grew and grew in the book and became critical to the book. And the main one is Oscar. Oscar was an immigrant who was in this country before the Reisky family came. The father starts to work he's a pushcart vendor because in Russia he had been a proprietor. I needed someone to bring Meyer, the father, along in the pushcarts. And so I came up with this Oscar. And then I liked him so much that I didn't want to let him go. I had thought I would just kind of make him in the background and then Meyer would go off. And I just kept finding reasons to use Oscar. And I'm really glad I did because he's my favorite character. And I never intended for him to be there.
That's exactly the process of writing.
Yep,
That's
absolutely.
Yeah, I found, I learned there's a term pantster, you know, when you write by the seat of your pants. And
yeah, that's me. That's me.
You too. Well, that's what happened with Ashes. One thing led to another, and the characters just grew. I will tell you that, well, that's a spoiler. I don't know if I want to talk about one of these characters, but maybe I shouldn't. It's a spoiler. But my husband asked me to knock off one of the characters because he couldn't stand him. And my husband's been my staff. He's done everything from IT to mailroom to you name it, and he's done it when it comes to the book. So I knocked off one of the characters for my husband. We did away with him. Yeah, I won't say one, but yeah.
Christine's book, she had a lot of friends that were compelling her to write a story, and they wanted her to write a story about vampires. And she refused to put vampires in her book. But spoiler alert, there's a vampire in the book, and he's funny as hell.
And he's everybody's favorite character.
Yeah, it's well, it was such a journey for me. I never envisioned that it would go that way, and I'm glad it went the way it did. And the book meant a lot to me. It was humbling, and there's been some lovely words written about it, and it kind of gave me the confidence to say, okay, the book was worth it, because I really wasn't sure. I kept saying I don't want to embarrass myself. So
no, it's beautiful. It's very well written. It's very, very, very good book.
Thank you. Thank you. That means a lot. What has meant a lot to me too is there are people who have, in their reviews, have said they learned stuff that that they didn't know about the ethnicity in the book, or it made them want to learn more and go look up things that happened in the book, and that pleases me knowing, because I love historical fiction, and that's the thing that I like about historical fiction, is that not only am I entertained, I'm informed, and I hope that the book did that too. That was a goal, I guess.
Well, you accomplished your goal.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
what's next? What's the next book you're going to write?
I have started on a book. I'm doing it the same way I did it last time, only this one is involving a lot more research. I think I've bitten off more than I can chew, but I'm going to keep at it. It starts in 1785 in Spain, where the Inquisition is still going on. And a family is accused of being, there were Jews that converted, but then in practice continued to observe their Judaism, and they're called crypto-Jews or conversos. And this young couple, the woman has been practicing her Judaism in secret. She's suspected of being a converso, and they were still burning at the stake and torturing and things like that. So they flee Spain and go to Charleston, South Carolina. Why Charleston? Because it was the rice, and it was very welcoming to Jews at the time. They go to live on a plantation because the husband's uncle owns it, and then we get into antebellum South Carolina and slavery. And there's kind of the running theme is that the main character continues to light the Shabbat candles in secret. And then today there are people in New Mexico and all over the country who observe some Jewish observances, like lighting the candles and the way they bury the dead. And they don't know why they do it. They don't know that way back when they had Jewish heritage. And the story will follow these candlesticks through a couple of generations, so that eventually they come to symbolize freedom. That's what I hope. It's going very slowly, very slowly. I can tell you anything you want to know about a rice plantation right now, if you want to know. Tell you all about flooding it and draining it and shipping it. I know everything about rice plantations. So that's where we are now.
I learned a lot from meeting you, and I'm definitely going to put your book on my to be read list.
It's wonderful, Elgon.
I know Christine speaks highly of it.
Thank you very much. It's really, it was a bucket list item for me, and to have fulfilled it and to have done it in a way that I feel like I did my family what I wanted to do, that I wanted to remember them and honor them for everything. That's what's tremendously gratifying to me. It's been a nice journey in that respect. And the second book, it's going to be a while. It's another 2.5 year journey, I think. And I'm a year into it, so I've got a year and a half to go. I want to make sure that I get it right, just like I did with this one.
Well, so. Books tend to take their own direction. Especially when, you don't apply an outline at first to the book. I mean, that's how I write. I don't know about Christine. Christine's more organized than I am, but
no.
But I let the characters tell the story, and the characters tell me what the conflicts are and what the plot is. Writing it becomes a discovery for me. I discover the story through the characters, and then after I finish the rough draft, I'll go back and I'll figure out what the outline should be for it and apply a structure to the story so that it actually says something to the reader. Because I think most writers, when they write things for themselves. And there's a lot of things in the book that you end up not using. Like you were talking about the character profiles that you wrote. The little biographies that you write on each of the characters. You need to do that because you need to know who your characters are. But that information doesn't end up in the book a lot of times. No,
and I agree. And the other thing, the way I write, and this is probably why it takes so long, is I know that some writers just write and go back and clean up later, but because everything is so dependent on getting the history or the subject correct, I don't go forward until I'm sure I've gotten down and correctly what I'm trying to do. For instance, planting the rice, or any one of a number of things that could come along. So it takes me much longer. I can spend a half a day on a paragraph because I'm making sure it's right before I go on. Ultimately, it means I have a cleaner first draft, hopefully. And then I do go back and take out I took many scenes out of Ashes too, because they didn't move the story forward. But yeah, so I know everybody works differently. And what I have to keep telling myself is that I shouldn't be counting words at the end of the day. If I've got a good paragraph, then I've accomplished something. Yeah. That's the hard part. And I also have to allow myself bad days. I know they're going to be.
Writers need to write something every day.
Yes.
To keep the process going of connecting their mind to their hands and their imaginations to the entire process, creative process. I don't care if it's a shopping list. You need to write something every day. You also need to set a certain time of the day that you do your writing, where everything's quiet. You're uninterrupted, and that's your time. That's your quality time to spend with the story that you're creating. So those are 2 points of advice I would give to any writer out there. Now, having said that, can you always find the time to write at a certain time of day? No. I mean,
No.
life happens. You got dogs, you got children, you got whatever interrupts you. The course of the day. That's your goal is to have some quiet time, some quality time. And when I started off as a writer, well before I ever envisioned being published, I would come home from work and I couldn't go to sleep because I'm still wound up from work. And I worked retail, so I got home, around midnight sometimes. I would write for 3 or 4 hours before I went to bed because I didn't have to get up the next day until, late in the morning, and, I could shower and go back to work, work the evening shift again. And then certain days I had to open the next day after closing. So, I couldn't, I can maybe write for an hour before I went to bed. I'd get like 3 hours sleep. But that's the kind of dedication that writers have to the story. And it's not something that once you start writing, it's not something you can just willfully turn off. It just keeps going.
Do you dream about it at night? Because I do sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
Or characters are flitting around. Yeah, you too?
My characters get upset if I haven't written, a part of their story, So, they try to send me little cryptic messages in my dreams, hey, you need to get back and finish this because, remember, I'm still stuck out in the middle of nowhere here.
Exactly.
It's not my fault. It's not my fault. You can't figure out what to do with me.
I agree 100%. But the other thing that I've learned, and I'm still a little hard on myself too, is that I do sometimes you need to allow yourself to step away and take a break. No, I'm not talking months. I mean, I'm talking like a day, to just, because I get an idea in my head and it just sticks and it's not a good one. And I need to step away and try to figure out another way to get to where I'm going. And
or sometimes you flesh out that idea and you get another idea from it, or you'll spend 2 or 3 days writing it and you end up scrapping the whole thing. But it's necessary. It's necessary for the process. It causes you to think about other things, or you see other relationships between the characters that you didn't know were there before.
Yeah. So. No, I agree. And it's a cliche now, but it is a journey. You just got to let it happen. I'm slowly but surely letting myself do that. I'm a little AC/DC, so it doesn't always work.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure, and so much fun. Thank you, both of you. It's been great.
Oh, it has been wonderful. Tell us, where can your fans find you? Where are you on social media?
Facebook mostly. I am on Twitter. I am on LinkedIn too, but mostly Facebook. And I have my own website. It's SharonGlogerFriedman.com. And but I pretty much concentrated on Facebook, and it's been lovely. People there have been very supportive. I have to say too, the author community is incredible, just incredibly supportive. As a newbie writer, I cannot thank there's so many of them I wish to thank for just their support and being there, and even just liking a post. I don't know, but they've been great. They really, it's a warm and welcoming community. It really is.
All right, the book's called Ashes, and it's by Sharon Gloger Friedman.
Gloger. Yeah.
Gloger Friedman, and it's available on Amazon. I recommend, based on this conversation, I'd recommend go reading it because I know I'm going to get it. and
Well, thank you.
Christine speaks highly of it. And I know
It's fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. It really has.